The top 5 UFO encounters maybe you haven't really heard of. We're going to talk about the Falcon Lake Incident. This one is a more famous one in Canada, I believe. On the afternoon of May 20th, 1967, a man named Stephen McCulloch stumbled onto the parking lot of the Falcon Motor Hotel. He seemed drunk or something. At least that's what the Falcon Beach Highway Patrol officer thought when he spotted the man walking down the highway earlier. McCulloch was an industrial mechanic by trade and an amateur geologist by night. He would often come out to Falcon, stay in the hotel, and prospect for quartz and silver in the woods. It was not unusual to see the man around, but something had gone wrong this time. On the parking lot, McCulloch approached the hotel owner and told her he needed a doctor. His eyes were bloodshot. He was out of sorts. What could have caused this? That day, there was no doctor in town, so McCulloch rested in his hotel room. He phoned his wife, and he told her that there had been an accident, but that he was okay. He asked her if she could have their son meet him at the bus terminal in Winnipeg. It would be on the next bus out of Falcon Lake. 10:45 p.m. The bus pulls into the station in Winnipeg, and McCulloch's son drove him directly to the hospital. When McCulloch was seen at the emergency room, he was nauseous and dizzy. He had severe burns on his upper abdomen. What he told the physician about the injuries was likely the strangest explanation the good doctor has ever heard. He had been burned by a blast of hot air from a UFO. His account would eventually make its way into almost every encyclopedia of UFO encounters and become the topic of an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. Stephen McCulloch had been in the woods near Falcon Lake across the highway from the town site. Chipping away at quartz veins, he looked up and saw 2 oval objects in the sky, glowing in an intense scarlet. The objects sunk down towards the ground, keeping a constant distance between them, weirdly operating like a single unit, until one stopped and hovered. The other ship continued to the ground, eventually coming to land quite near where McCulloch knelt. The craft, still in the air, ascended and disappeared. In dead silence, it left twin resting on a flat section of Precambrian rock. Still kneeling with pick hammer in hand, McCulloch watched through the protective goggles on his face. The scarlet red of the craft faded into a stainless steel sheen, and he noticed an open hatch on the side of the craft. A lozenge-shaped opening about 2 feet by 3 feet in size. Warm air came off the craft in gusts, each wave wafting. The smell of sulfur came McCulloch's way. A tiny electric motor whirled. Air hissed slightly, but mostly it was quiet out there in the woods. Just a man in goggles and a parked UFO. McCulloch scanned the hull for identifying decals, perhaps of the United States Air Force. Light poured out of the upper circle of the craft, flooding the ground with purple. It was so bright that it outshone the midday sun, and when McCulloch looked away, his vision was obscured by bright spots. He stood and moved closer. Within 60 feet, he listened. There were voices. He held his breath and strained to hear. From inside the craft came 2 distinct voices, one with a higher pitch than the other. They sounded human enough, although too muffled to make out what they were saying. "Okay, Yankee boys, having trouble?" McCulloch said aloud, breaking the silence. "Come on out and we'll see what we can do about it." Falcon Lake isn't far from American border, and these were the Cold War days. There were all kinds of secret military things going on, supposedly. No reply from the craft. He took some steps closer, hesitated, then walked right up to the small hatch and peered into the opening. There were lights everywhere, focus beams shining across the interior. A series of flashing lights switched on and off in seemingly random sequences. He stepped away. The craft remained motionless. There were no signs of welding or seams to be seen anywhere. It was extraordinary. McCulloch reached out with his gloved hand and touched its side. It was hot, burning hot. He pulled his glove away and saw it was melted. Without warning, the entire craft tilted slightly. McCulloch felt a scorching pain across his chest. The shirt burst into flames. Instinctively, McCulloch turned away and tore off his shirt and unshirt himself. He felt a rush of air around him and looked back at the craft. It was already rising above the treetops. And then it was nowhere. Gone. Just like that. McCulloch felt nauseous. His head began to ache. Then it ached more. He broke into a sweat and vomited everywhere, all over the rocks. He covered himself with his light jacket and started through the bush towards town. Something was wrong with him. The dots in his vision returned, pink dots imprinted over everything he saw. He vomited again and fought to remain conscious as the headache pounding in his skull. He felt the burning on his chest. His jacket irritated his sores on his abdomen, and he moved through the woods. When he finally reached the highway, he flagged down a police officer, the one who reported his apparent drunkenness. Eventually, McCulloch made it back to the hotel parking lot on his own steam, the place where we began this story. The whole thing does sound likely, but according to archived Royal Canadian Mounted Police, you know, they ride mooses. This went from a case of too many wobbly pops to a full-blown UFO hunt by the police, Army, and Air Force. Locals all remember the military helicopters overhead that spring. An Air Force chopper with a crew of 7 soldiers and 2 RCMP officers landed on the golf course one evening. They had just spent the day making passes over the woods. The next day, Canadian Army helicopters joined the search. They combed the area with teams on the ground and in the air. They found some landmarks that McCulloch had described, but nothing more. His instructions were too vague. According to McCulloch's physician, he had been too sick to participate in the initial days of the search. He hadn't been able to eat solid food since the incident and had dropped 13 pounds. But 2 RCMP officers drove back to Winnipeg that night and knocked on his door. The pair convinced McCulloch to come out to Falcon Lake with them the next morning. They took McCulloch up to the Army helicopter, but nothing looked familiar from above. He didn't do much better on the ground with the team, and so after dark, the RCMP drove McCulloch back to Winnipeg. After dropping him off at his house, the officers turned around and drove the 2 hours back to Falcon Lake to regroup with the military. On the evening of one of the search days, there was a gathering in the hotel lounge with some suspicious-looking folks. The hotel owner was curious and asked where they were all from. One of the men said he was with the NASA. The helicopters in the sky continued for a 4th day. Well, this time, there were 2 other foreign groups leading their own investigation. The head of the UFO project for the United States government was around, as well as members of the American group ARPO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, which at the time had a large staff of consultant PhD scientists. Locals really weren't sure what to make of it all. It was an outrageous sounding report. Some guy wandered into the woods and had been burned by the exhaust of a UFO? Question mark? Exclamation point? With another question mark? Could it really be extraterrestrials? Was it the Russians? Was it just an elaborate hoax? Question mark. Maybe McCulloch was just a wacko who burned himself with a barbecue. Maybe, but it could not be denied that there were helicopters thumping in the air and that things were getting weird out of Falcon Lake. A fun thing to do in the area at the time was to go to the garbage dump in the evening and watch the bears. Small town, that's the only fun thing to do. A server from the hotel was out on a date with her boyfriend, doing just that. On the drive home from a romantic time at the dump, they saw a silver object in the sky. It appeared out of nowhere and followed them. The boyfriend stepped on the gas and flew down the road back to the relative safety of the town. The server lived in the staff accommodations at the hotel and was so shaken that she would not come out of her room in the morning. Sometime later, the son of the hotel owners, young Steve Busek, got a phone call from his friends, brothers Bob and Bill. They told him they could hear an electronic sound coming from the woods near Penguin Resort, where they lived. Steve returned the phone to its cradle and walked down the old road to Penguin Resort. It was completely dark. When he came around the bend, down the final hill to Bob and Bill's house, he could hear it loud and clear. It was a beeping. It pulsated from the trees. The 3 boys lit their flashlights and ventured into the woods. The source of the sound seemed to move around them. It was right in front of them, and it was behind them, and somewhere else entirely. What the fuck? Huh! When the sun rose the next day, young Steve talked with Ed Schindler, a local trapper who was a friend of his father. Something of an expert on many objects. Steve told him about the electronic beeping in the forest. Ed Schindler laughed. Ha 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 ha. He said he believed them about the beeping. It was called the saw-wheat owl. It was an owl. That's one mystery solved anyways. As for Stephen McCulloch, an undated letter from the DND, they weren't sure what happened. They're unable to provide any evidence which would dispute McCulloch's story. So now this is just left to our imagination. Folks in the chats, what do you think it was? Do you believe this is a real story? Do you believe maybe he just got drunk and he burned himself barbecuing out in the woods? Probably didn't even have a portable barbecue back then. What do you guys think? Let me know. Moving on to number 2. This one takes place in Africa, in Zimbabwe. 1996, in Bindura, about 90 kilometers from Harare. A 17-year-old named Lloyd Karam Bakua, a student of the Herman Gmeiner Secondary School. So it was between 1 and 1:30 on March 6th, 1996. It was 1:30 in the morning. He woke up because he knew it would be the quiet hour. And at that hour, he decided to do some studying for his exams. While engaged with his studying, he heard a clicking sound, not unlike a telephone dialing, except that there are no telephones in this area. It continued for some minutes, so Lloyd decided to get up and check it out. What could it be? What was causing this clicking outside? He opened the front door and looked out. He could hear the sound coming from up the road. And when he glanced in that direction, he witnessed something very, very peculiar and strange. He quickly went outside and hid behind a hedge to get a better view. He was able to observe a small figure about 1 meter high, with a head like a rugby ball, dressed all in white overalls, and on its back, the creature had a small satchel, attached to which was an aerial with a flashing red light. Lloyd was terrified. He told me he was asphyxiated with fear and ran back into the house, jumped into the bed and covered himself up with a blanket, shivering, scared. He eventually fell asleep for the rest of the night. 6 in the next morning, he went to look where the creature had walked, and he found several footprints, which he could not identify and which he attributed to the creature. When he arrived at school, he told his friends about seeing a ghost in the night, but one of his friends suggested that it was a UFO. Lloyd is now under the impression that the creature is called UFO. Opposite Lloyd's house is a teaching center, guarded at night by a security firm. Inquiries led to one of the guards, a woman named Kumbadzai, who had been on duty at the center when she saw what she called a ghost. She was so disturbed by this event that she had found herself another job elsewhere. Kumbadzai told that she had heard clicking sounds and been frightened, had hidden behind a wall, and seen a figure in white. It passed her twice, and the second time, the figure had been covered in a rainbow colors. What do you guys think of that one? I don't know. I need more evidence, right? I need more evidence, guys. Moving on to the next one, guys. We're going to be talking about the Broadhaven UFO sighting. This one's a little popular, I think. This is one of the wave of sightings back in the era of 1977. You probably remember that year, guys, don't you? Dubbed the Dyfed Triangle. David Davies, he was only 10 years old at the time, and heard reports of people seeing flying saucers throughout the day. He said this: "I was a natural-born skeptic, so after the bell rang, I decided to go to the area that the children said they had seen it." And he described seeing a silver cigar-shaped craft with a dome covering the middle third. Only lasted a couple seconds. It popped up, then it went back behind a tree. Davies said he did not feel afraid, more in awe and wonderment, though he admitted he had a strange desire to run away. None of the teachers believed the children, and so the headmaster separated them and got them to draw what they saw. There were slight variations, but what they drew was basically the same thing. Davies described the days that followed as a wild roller coaster. It went crazy with the media, and it was difficult to settle down and actually think about what he had seen. 2 months later, Rosa Granville, who ran the Haven Fort Hotel in nearby Little Haven, described seeing an object which looked like an upside-down saucer and 2 faceless humanoids with pointy heads. Cone heads? She said so much heat came off it, her face felt burned. A nice suntan. There was lights coming from it and flames of all colors. Then the creatures came out of these flames. That's what I don't understand. When she visited the field, she said there were 2 inches of burned ground. Miss Granville said the incident left her agitated and disturbed. A number of theories has been put forward to explain these sightings. Nicholas Edwards, the MP of Pembroke, contacted the Ministry of Defense after being inundated with UFO sightings. The Lieutenant Cohen, an officer from the RAF Brody, visited Miss Granville's hotel and examined the site, but could find no evidence of a landing. He joked, should a UFO arrive at RAF Brody, we will charge normal landing fees. Ha 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 ha. We are funny around these parts. In his report, he mentioned that possibly that a local prankster was at work, and the description of aliens fit exactly the type of protection suit that would have been issued in the event of a fire at one of the local oil refineries. This fits in with the accounts of businessman Glenn Edwards, who in 1996 revealed he wandered around the area in a silver suit in 1977 as a prank. Son of a bitch. The National Archives also released files which examined UFO sightings across Wales, and the officials who investigated the Broadhaven sightings suspected pranksters. It was also thought school children could have confused a sewage tank as UFO. although many were from farming backgrounds and would have been familiar with machinery. A former U.S. Navy sailor said the figure in a silver suit was in fact a member of the U.S. military personnel wearing their standard fireproof uniform, and UFOs were new terror jet flying over. This is just like the military to try and cover things up, right? Now, it's been some time that this has happened. What do you guys think it was? Do you believe it was aliens, or do you believe it was something much more? Here are the pictures. Here's like the cigar shaped with like the UFO behind the trees. Again, same thing kind of, right? This has like the little button on top. Same thing. Broadhaven. Same idea. Same idea. They didn't report any like crazy noise, any fighter jets. I think 10-year-olds would know what a plane sounds like. Next UFO. I don't know if you guys have heard this one. This one's, maybe it's a little bit more famous. I don't know. It's the unsolved mystery of the Lubbock lights. The UFO sightings. So come with me back to the August 25th, 1951. You know, it was a quiet summer night in Lubbock, Texas. That evening, a handful of scientists from Texas Technical College were hanging out in the backyard of geology professor Dr. W.I. Robinson, drinking tea, chatting about many things. It was quite the brain trust, okay? Chemical engineer, physicists, petroleum engineering department. They're smart, which made the story all the more curious. It was around 9:20 p.m. the university colleagues saw something otherworldly in the expansive Texas sky. A V-shaped formation of 15 to 30 bluish-green lights passing overhead. Stunned, but still using their trained scientific reasoning, they figured the lights would reappear. And they did. About an hour later, in a more haphazard formation, the scientists were all in agreement they had witnessed something fantastic. But what was it that they witnessed? The professors weren't the only credible witnesses to this mysterious blue and green lights at the night sky. At dusk in Albuquerque, New Mexico, about 350 miles away from Lubbock, an employee of the Atomic Energy Commission's top-secret Sandia Corporation, a man with a high-level Q security clearance, had been sitting outside with his wife. They were gazing at the night sky, commenting of how beautiful it was when both of them were startled at the sight of a huge airplane flying swiftly and silently over their home. On the aft edge of the wings, there were 6 to 8 pairs of soft, glowing bluish lights. An hour or so after, according to a retired rancher from Lubbock, his wife had seen something terrifying in the night sky and described it this way. Just after dark, his wife had gone outdoors to take some sheets off the clothesline because who needs a dryer? He was inside the house reading the paper. Suddenly his wife had rushed into the house, as white as the sheets she was carrying. The reason his wife was so upset was that she had seen a large object glide swiftly and silently over the house. She said it looked like an airplane without a body. On the back edge of the wing were pairs of glowing bluish lights. By the time Ruppelt, who was the guy, flew into Lubbock to investigate the sightings in late September, hundreds of residents had seen the lights over a period of 2 weeks. It wasn't just 1 or 2 people, but it was a bunch of people. Hundreds. Residents from all over. How do you explain that? Government. Now we have some locals. They even snapped some photos. Not everyone had waited for the government to start looking into the matter. After alerting local papers like the Lubbock Avalanche Journal, the Texas Tech professors started their own informal investigation. In the weeks after their initial August 25th sighting, they and their friends observed the lights 12 more times. They measured the lights' angles, roughly calculated their speed, and noted that they always traveled from north to south. Armed with walkie-talkies, the scientists, sleuths, and their friends formed 2 teams and attempted to measure the UFO's altitude with little success. As the days went on, more and more Lubbock residents claimed to have seen the lights, and when the professor cross-checked these reports against what they themselves had seen and recorded, many of the facts lined up. But while many observers offered incomplete or poorly expressed recollections, there's little doubt that whatever people were seeing was something real. UFO sightings are usually one-off events, but these blue-green lights were observed multiple times by hundreds of people. These are the pictures. These are said pictures. This V-shape, these are the lights, similar kind of thing. Think it was a spacecraft? Think it was like a secret government airplane? Sky people? Nazis invading from the moon? For many, there was physical proof. Black and white photos taken by a Texas Tech freshman named Carl Hart Jr. is what we just looked at there. It was a warm night and his bed was pushed over next to an open window. He was looking out at the clear night sky and had been in bed about a half an hour when he saw a formation of the lights appear in the north, cross an open patch of sky, and disappear over his house. Knowing that the lights might reappear, as they had done in the past, he grabbed his loaded Kodak 35 set the lens and shutter at f3.5 in 1/10 of a second, and went out into the middle of the backyard. Before long, his vigil was rewarded when the lights made a second pass. He got 2 pictures. A third formation went over a few minutes later, and he got 3 more pictures. These are very debated images. Are they even real, doctored? But it turns out they're real. Now the question is, was it birds? Was it planes? The government? To this day, it's still a mystery, and nobody really knows what happened that night, except for the residents that were there. Moving on to the 5th and final UFO sightings. Hopefully you guys are enjoying these little UFO stories. If you are, be sure to hit that follow button. We are live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The Rendells Ham Forest Ufo. Vince Thurkettle was out chopping wood one morning in Rendells Ham Forest in late December 1980 when a car drew up on him. 2 men stepped out, about ages 30, dressed in suits. Can you guess who these were? They said, "Good morning, do you mind if we ask you some questions?" It was earlier that day, on the 26th and 28th of December, that USAF, the United States Air Force, security personnel stationed at nearby RAF Woodsbridge had reported seeing strange lights in the surrounding forests. Forestry worker Mr. Thurkettle's unannounced and unidentified visitors asked if he had been out the previous night. He said no, it was not. They said, "Did you leave the house at all? Did you see anything?" He said, "What?" They said, "Oh, there's a report of some red lights in the forest. We're just checking." And the 2 of them, very politely but firmly, asked him probably about 20 questions, and he thought they were journalists. Men in black, more like it. And then they left. But for the next few days, this guy, he bought the papers every day for the next few days to find out what was going on. But there's nothing in the papers, right? 3 years later, though, however, the sightings made a news of the world front page story. It proclaimed UFO lands in Suffolk, and that's official. The story was based on a memo from RAF Woodbridge Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Cole Charles Hall, the Ministry of Defense. It was released by the U.S. government and described an encounter with an apparent UFO in the forests. Quotations, "We have a sighting of some unusual lights in the sky. We have sent some unarmed troops to investigate. We are terming it as a UFO at present." Since then, the sightings have been the source of much debate and speculation among UFO enthusiasts, and the subject of numerous books, articles, and TV programs, X-Files, and some other stuff. The forest even has its own official UFO trail, complete with life-size replicas of a flying saucer. Mr. Thurkettle says the UK authorities have said they did not learn about the incident until Halt's memo. The memo was not written until 2 weeks after he received the visit, so someone must have told them before. Only after the visit did Mr. Thurkettle begin to hear rumors of a UFO sighting in the forest. So he begged his boss to show him the scene, but when he got there, his heart absolutely plummeted. It was nothing. It was an absolutely normal glade in the forest with 3 rabbit scrapes. They're all carefully marked. They happened to be roughly in a triangle. They pinned the area with flags to hey, this is where it happened. So this whole story blew up because the government, the military, released a paper about a possible UFO landing. And so now the question is, did it really happen? But again, if it didn't happen, then why would they say that it did? Who were the visitors? The men in black? Possibly. To this day, hasn't really been explained. What do you guys think? You think it happened? You think it's real? You think the military, government met aliens inside the woods, flashing red lights? What do you guys think? Let me know. If you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a comment, like the video, and I'll see you in the next spooky one.